I hereby open this academic ceremony of Maastricht University. And I welcome everyone watching this ceremony online. I'm delighted that you are joining us for this PhD defense. First and foremost, I welcome the PhD candidate, Huizi, who will today defend her academic thesis entitled Protecting Societal Interest in Corporate Takeovers, a comparative analysis of the regulatory framework in the UK, Germany, and China. Huizi does so before the committee here present that will decide upon the award of the degree. And I welcome all members of the committee, and in particular the members coming from outside of Maastricht University, Professor Lei Chen and Professor Wijshaar. And I also welcome the supervisors, Professors Philipsen and Olaerts. Huizi, I now invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis. You have the floor.
Thank you. Dear Pro-Rector, dear members of the Corona, dear family and friends, thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present my research in the coming 15 minutes. The title of my thesis is Protecting Societal Interests in Corporate Takeovers, a comparative analysis of the regulatory framework in the UK, Germany, and China. During my presentation, I would like to introduce the research background, research questions, structure, and the main findings of my thesis. It's widely accepted that takeovers as a form of control transaction have efficiency creation functions. Takeovers may have a disciplinary effect on the incumbent management of a company, meaning that the management is often under the pressure to maximize the value of the company in order to avoid potential takeovers. To this extent, takeovers may enhance managerial efficiency. Besides, as a form of resource allocation, takeovers may also facilitate the acquisition of resources by more efficient companies and create synergies. These efficiency creation functions have been discussed by abundant literature. However, takeovers may also cause inefficiencies and have varied implications on different stakeholders. For example, while the target shareholders making profits from share premiums, the employees may lose their jobs. The synergies of the takeovers often resulted from the increase in the market power, which may threaten competitive competition. In some foreign takeovers, the national security interest may sometimes be put under risk. However, in the existing literature of takeovers, protection of non-shareholder stakeholders is often neglected. The thesis presumes that the stakeholders whose interests may be affected by a takeover include not only those who are directly related to the targets and the acquirer company through a contractual relationship, but also others who are indirectly related to the takeover parties. The thesis refers to the first type of stakeholders as contractual stakeholders and the second as other societal stakeholders. Altogether, they are called as relevant stakeholders, and their interests are referred to as relevant societal interests of takeovers. The UK, Germany, and China has established regulatory frameworks of takeovers consisting of both government regulation and private regulation. The government regulation, as examined in this thesis, mainly include the national competition law, FDI screening laws, takeover law, and corporate law in the three jurisdictions. And the private regulation mainly refers to the National Corporate Governance Code in the three countries. The thesis consists of 7 chapters, and the main research questions it explored is: what are the relevant societal interests that might be affected by a takeover? Are these protected under the current regulatory framework of the three jurisdictions? And if yes, how are they protected? And what recommendations could be made for future reforms? To answer this question, the thesis investigated 4 sub-questions. Question 1 examines the relevant market failures that can be caused by takeover. Question 2 examines the relevant societal interests that are currently regulated, as well as the protection mechanisms under the regulatory frameworks in each of the 3 jurisdictions. Question 3 concludes the similarities and differences, strengths and weaknesses of the 3 jurisdictions in dealing with the relevant market failures and protecting different societal interests. Question 4 investigated what potential recommendations could be made for future reforms. The main findings of the thesis are as follows. With regard to question 1, the thesis found that 4 types of market failures may arise as a result of takeover. That is, the increase of market power, the severe information asymmetries, negative externalities, and undersupply of public goods, and they may affect different stakeholders. The relevant societal interests of takeovers can be categorized into 3 types. The first type are the interests of corporate stakeholders who are directly related to the target company through the contractual relationship and usually directly bear the consequences of a takeover, such as the target employees and target shareholders. The second type are referred to as the legally recognized public interest considerations, which usually have far-reaching impact on the whole country and are explicitly stipulated by the law. The national security interest is the most quoted example of this type. And the third type is referred to as other societal interests affected by a takeover, which may also have wide social impact, but have not been recognized by the law as public interest. And the representative cases of this type are the protection of the environment and the local community where the target company resides. With regard to question 2 and question 3, the thesis first found that the competition law and FDI screening laws in the 3 jurisdictions all recognize certain public interest considerations to deal with the potential monopoly, negative externalities, information asymmetries, and undersupply of public goods. In the competition law regime, the public interest intervention mechanism in the UK and public interest exemption mechanism in Germany and China allow the public authorities to protect non-competition societal interests in the name of public interest. By comparison, the competition law in the UK provides for more explicit examples of these public interest considerations, such as the national security interest, media plurality, financial stability, and the country's capability to combat public health emergencies. And the relevant roles in Germany and China are rather general without giving exact examples of these public interest considerations. In the FDI screening regime, the 3 jurisdictions all provide for a national security review to protect certain interests in foreign takeovers. In the UK and Germany, the security review has been long focused on protecting the defense interest. In recent years, especially in 2020, the 2 jurisdictions conducted a series of reforms to enlarge the scope of sectors and activities as relating to the security interest and to enlarge the government's power to intervene in foreign takeovers. In China, in addition to this national security review, it also has a more complex market access regulation system and other administrative regulation of foreign takeovers to protect not only the defense interest, but also the economic security and social life order in foreign takeovers. As an exception to these public law mechanisms, China also established some corporate governance-related roles to specifically regulate takeovers by SOEs in order to protect the societal interests, such as the international competitiveness of the SOEs in the name of public interest. Secondly, the thesis found that the takeover laws in the 3 jurisdictions mainly protect the interests of corporate stakeholders, primarily shareholders. In the UK and China, the shareholder meeting decides on the anti-takeover actions of the board of directors. In Germany, apart from the actions that are within the the management board, other anti-takeover actions of the management board are subject to an approval from the supervisory board, which therefore gives the supervisory board and employee representatives a prominent role in takeovers. Besides, UK and Germany provided for some disclosure roles on the acquirer and target board with regard to the potential consequences of a takeover on non-shareholder stakeholders. By comparison, China lacks such roles. However, given the fact that apart from the employee co-determination in Germany, other stakeholders don't have direct engagement channels in the corporate decision. Therefore, these disclosure roles also only play a limited role in takeovers. Moreover, UK provides more direct protection for non-shareholder stakeholders by its post-offer undertakings and post-offer intention statements, which encourage and allow the acquirer and the target company to make arrangements for non-shareholder stakeholders. In the corporate governance regime, the Thesis observed that the corporate law and national corporate governance code in the three jurisdictions only play a marginal role in dealing with the relevant market failures. The basic corporate governance mechanisms in the corporate law, such as the corporate organs, powers, and the director's fiduciary duties, lay the foundation for the shareholder protection in the takeover law regime. Apart from these, the corporate law and national corporate governance code all provided for some roles with regard to stakeholder protection and corporate social responsibilities. However, the generality in the content of these CSR roles and the lack of guidance for their implementation all reduce their effectiveness in a takeover. Besides, the corporate law in the UK and Germany also provide for some disclosure roles on the board of directors to provide report on non-financial stakeholder issues which implemented the relevant EU directive. However, as the same problem in the takeover law regime, as other stakeholders don't have a direct engagement channel, those also play a marginal role in a takeover situation. Based on these findings, the Thesis proposed some recommendations. First, it proposed that the expansion of the recognized public interest considerations in the competition law and FDI screening laws should be conducted cautiously and follow principles of necessity and proportionality. Secondly, in the takeover law regime, it proposed that future reforms should work towards incentivizing the acquirer company and the target company to make arrangements for non-shareholder stakeholders. In this field, the UK should work towards enhancing the current mechanism's effectiveness, and Germany and China should learn from the UK by introducing similar mechanisms such as post-offer undertakings. Besides, China should learn from the UK and Germany by introducing disclosure requirements on the target board to give a report on the potential consequences of a takeover on non-shareholder stakeholders. In the corporate governance regime, future reforms should work towards incentivizing the corporate law by introducing more engagement mechanisms on the board of directors for non-shareholder stakeholders. For example, the corporate law should introduce and should encourage the board of directors to establish an advisory stakeholder panel representing different stakeholders and should leave the autonomy to the management board for them to decide which stakeholder group should be represented in a takeover situation. More importantly, the corporate law and national corporate governance code should work towards incentivizing shareholders, inter alia, institutional shareholders, to better consider other stakeholders' interests in their decision and to disclose their engagement policy with regard to these stakeholder matters. In this regard, the responsible principles on the responsible investment as launched by the United Nations and some ESG standards should be referred to more often in the corporate governance regime in the future. This concludes my presentation today. Thank you very much for your attention. I will now give the floor back to the pro-rector. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Faure. Professor Faure is Professor of Comparative and International Environmental Law at our university, and he is also the chair of the assessment committee.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rector. Mrs. Candidate, I first of all want to congratulate you with a job well done. The question of how to protect societal interest in corporate takeovers is a hot topic, and you provide an excellent comparative and economic analysis of the regulatory framework in the UK, Germany, and China. In your conclusions, you recommend, inter alia, that the expansion of recognized public interest considerations, both in competition law and in FDI screening laws, should be conducted cautiously and should follow principles of necessity and proportionality. So you say on page 293. You are, hence, in your thesis, strongly focusing on the possibility for a country to expand public interest considerations, thus allowing to block a takeover. For example, if the country would judge that it might jeopardize societal interests. My concern is the reverse. In the framework of the Green Deal in Europe and the energy transition, the economies of the EU member states need radical changes and investments in green energy. Some of this may take place through greenfield investment, but to some extent, mergers and takeovers may be necessary. Now, the Europeans may like it or not, but reality is that China is much stronger as far as know-how in green energy is concerned, and it is therefore likely that Europe may need Chinese investments, but probably also takeovers to realize the energy transition so needed in the EU. What may, however, happen, many authors have already warned for this, is that competition law or FDI screening laws could be used to block Chinese investments through screening mechanisms. Now, this may jeopardize energy transition in Europe. So here is my question. Should the societal interests that you refer to not equally include sustainability? If you agree with that, do you also see possibilities to let sustainability arguments set aside the blocking of a green takeover, for example, by a Chinese investor? In other words, should sustainability not equally be included in the societal interests that you refer to, but then not as an argument to block a takeover, but precisely to allow it, and to set aside political and other arguments that could otherwise block a green and therefore beneficial takeover, for example, by a Chinese investor of a European company? I look forward to your reaction.
I think you still need to, dear candidates, you need to unmute. Thank you so much.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your questions. If I understood correctly, you raised two questions. First one is if the sustainability interest, as recently discussed, against the background of the EU Green Deal, should be incorporated as another public interest considerations. And the second is, if yes, can this societal interest be used to block or to exempt some takeovers to facilitate the achievement of this EU Green Deal transaction, EU Green Deal proposals? With regard to your first question, I totally agree that this sustainability interest should be regarded as a public interest consideration, because in my research, the thesis already observed that in the three jurisdictions, they are paying increasing attention on the environmental protection. For example, in Germany, in its previous cases on its public interest exemption system, the minister have explained that protecting the federal government's environmental policies should be regarded as one of the public interest considerations. And in China, as the Green Deal meeting that took place in the other day, Chinese professor Wang Sanfa also put forward that now the carbon neutrality goal is paying much more attention by both the Chinese government, and it's reflected in most of the investment policies in China. So I think this societal interest is without doubt should be regarded as a public interest. And with regard to your second question, you first raised some concerns whether such public interest considerations would be used to either block foreign investments or to be an exemption reason for some maybe anti-competitive investments. I can totally understand this concern because against the background of this EU Green Deal, to protect the industries in the EU, it may have to import some energies from other countries. On the other side, these energies, if it's not satisfy the carbon standards, it might be taxed or be imposed with some restrictions. And I think in the situation as you put forward, that if Chinese investor would like to conduct a takeover in the EU member states, when the public authorities of the EU member states assesses its takeover, it should find a way to combine both considerations under these EU Green Deal proposals with the other considerations, such as whether this takeover have benefits on the effective competition. For example, if the Chinese investors' investment can promote the employment situation in the local market of these member states, but on the other side, there might be some unsatisfactory carbon neutrality performance of this investor, it should be left to the public authority to make these assessments. And I think when making this evaluation or assessment, the public authorities should consider a lot of different factors. The EU Green Deal may be only one factor, and how to promote the employment and the development of the economy is another factor. But the most important principle is not don't be too much to be subject to the protectionism, as some investors are now worrying that if the EU government or the member state, the governments in the government, the government in the member states will use these EU Green Deal proposals to go back to our protectionism stance. And I think that's the most important principle when making this evaluation. I hope I have answered your question. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your satisfactory answer.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Now the opposition will be continued by Professor Lei Chen, who is Professor of Chinese Law at Durham Law School in the UK. And I very much welcome Professor Chen to Maastricht University today. It's very good to have you here with us. You have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Yang. And thank you, Huizi, for your very concise and engaging presentation to map out the summary of your thesis. I enjoy reading it thoroughly. And my question is very straightforward. One thing you haven't provided in detail in your presentation is about the objective of your research, objective of your thesis, right? And in the chapter 1 of your thesis, you talk about the thesis aim to identify who the stakeholders are and how they are protected under the current legal frameworks of each jurisdiction, and what are the societal interests you are referring to. So all sounds a little bit introductory, right? But you have done much more than this, because in the final chapter, in the conclusion, the recommendations, you made a number of recommendations. You basically provide some future directions of legal reform in some jurisdictions in UK, in China, in Germany, you should do this or that, right? So that recommendations must be made on the basis of yardstick, right? So the criteria, which is the central thesis of your dissertation, right? So my question is this. So if you can, and as you did, to provide recommendations, right? And basically that is through a very careful comparative analysis. That is gone through a very careful process of teasing out this common ground or criteria, yardstick, right, by which you use to measure. So would you consider in your introduction addressing this assessment or highlighting this yardstick that would be making your thesis more flow, if I may? So that is my question. I hope you understand what I'm saying.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your comments and for your question. If I understand correctly, you are asking maybe I should, or it would be better for me to add more explicit criteria for the assessment in my thesis, because that's directly related to the objective of my thesis, what I want to do with all these observations of the regulatory frameworks. Okay, and I think the yardstick of my thesis, of all the observations, is that I want to argue that because different societal interests, their interests would be affected in a takeover. Therefore, overall regulatory framework should be established in different jurisdictions. So my objective is to use the findings, maybe to try to promote or to give some implementations on how this overall regulatory framework will include. For example, because most of the existing literature, they only focus on like the FDI screening regulations or discussions on the anti-takeover measures, they focus on one aspect of the takeovers or takeover regulation. So the objective that I would like to use this thesis to assume or to pursue is to build a more integrative approach on stakeholder regulation. That also explains why I introduces the different aspects of this regulatory framework, and I analyzes each of their advantages and their disadvantages. And then in the last chapter of it, I made these recommendations. These recommendations are they are not one size fits all form that might be used for all jurisdictions, but my expectation is that based on these recommendations, at least for policymakers, they may have some clue on like which aspects of the regulatory framework is still inefficient, or which aspect should be reinforced, and which stakeholders should be given more attention. And if the corporate governance in their jurisdiction still needs to change some fundamental idea, like the shareholder primacy notion, it's like that. So I think this, to build an integrative regulatory framework and to give implications for future policy makings, is the main objective of my thesis. And that also gives a criterion for all my analysis as well as the recommendations in my thesis. Thank you. I hope this answered your question.
Yeah, sure. It is quite sufficient. Thank you for providing this research objectives in more detail. And a follow-up comment based on what you have answered is you are a little bit modest. What I'm trying to suggest is just to highlight. You are going to evaluate, you are going to assess by making your recommendations. Of course, you have to do justice to your objectives through the chapters 3, 4, 5, and 6. And that is just a small suggestion for your consideration. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thank you so much, Professor Chen, also for being present here in this ceremony. I know that you have to leave towards the end of the ceremony, so I really like to thank you very much for your participation in this event.
Thank you for the invitation. I will stay until 10 o'clock. Sorry, 11 Europe.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much. We will now continue with our next opponent. And our next opponent is Professor Wijshaar. Professor Wijshaar is Professor of Law and Economics at the University of Groningen. He is also a member of the Assessment Committee. And I would also very much like to welcome Professor Wijshaar as a regular guest to our university. You have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Rector. It's always a great pleasure to be back at my alma mater. Dear Madam Candidate, my compliments to this highly topical and impressive work. Not only did you dare to focus on a stubborn issue of takeovers, but you did so from an interdisciplinary law and economics perspective and by comparing the jurisdictions of the UK, Germany, and China with each other. I very much enjoyed your work. Congratulations. I would like to ask a question on your policy recommendations. You advise that the legislators should expand competition law or FDI screening laws to recognize the societal interests as public interests and suggest that this would allow the public authorities to act promptly and powerfully to respond to emergencies. I would like to invite you to elaborate more on this point. Which one should be expanded, the FDI screening laws or competition laws? Are there differences in the efficiency and effectiveness of these public laws?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your question. If I understand correctly, you mentioned 3 questions. First one that you would like me to explain more about if I propose that public interest considerations should be expanded in the public laws. And second is in which specific field, competition law or the FDI screening law. And the third one is if there's differences between their effectiveness in dealing with the relevant problems.
If I might interrupt, Madam Candidate, I think my focus of the question is on points 2 and 3.
Okay, thank you. With regard to your first question, I would like to explain a little bit because I didn't intend to say or to propose that the public authorities should expand or the public laws should expand the recognition of societal interest as public interest. My suggestion is that, or my recommendation is that if they have to expand relevant societal interests as public interest considerations, some principles should be followed. And then you also mentioned that this expansion may allow them to act promptly in some situations. That is one of the conditions that I have mentioned in my thesis for the situations under which this should be expanded. Because I mentioned that when they want to expand these public interest considerations, they first should consider if the relevant societal interests have far-reaching impact on the whole society. And secondly, if the existing private law mechanisms have already been efficient or have the potential to be amended to be efficient to deal with these problems. And only when the private law mechanisms don't have this potential should public law stepped in to expand this, because in principle, I argue that the protection of stakeholders should be the corporate governance realm of a company. Then it comes to your second question, if the expansion, if they happens, should be happen in competition law or FDI screening laws. First, I think two of the two fields are closely related, especially in the current situation against the COVID-19 pandemic. We can see from the three jurisdictions that usually they made reforms first to its competition law to add new public interest considerations, to review the concentration of undertakings in both the domestic market or for some investors from foreign countries or or regions, and then the reforms in the competition regime often lead to some new reforms in the FDI screening regime. As far as I observed from the three jurisdictions, for example, in the UK, it's first that since 2016, it modified its competition law to lower the thresholds for reviewing merger or takeover in crucial fields such as critical technology or critical information. And this change is not specifically targeted at foreign takeovers. But then as the number of foreign takeovers in these fields are increasing in recent years, it then made an independent or separate FDI screening law to strengthen the FDI review. And in Germany, it adopts a similar way. The reforms first take place in the competition law, and it doesn't only target at the defense interest, but also some high technologies. And then with the increasing of foreign takeovers, it made several amendments in its FDI screening regime, particularly to implement the newly established EU FDI screening framework. So I think the two regimes are closely related. And for a third question, if there's difference for the efficiency in the changes in these two fields, I think it's really a really important question, because when the public authorities they made such reforms to these different regimes, they usually have to make assessments which field the reforms taking place in which field should be more efficient. And I think as currently the relevant roles in the competition law and FDI law, they aim at protecting different societal interests. So it's hard to compare the efficiency, the overall efficiency, because with regard to regulating the mergers and takeovers in the internal markets, I think maybe the public expansion in the competition law in the future would be more efficient, because reviewing because the relevant roles in these fields, they can directly have effectiveness on the internal market. But with regard to some foreign takeovers, the FDI screening, especially the national security review, allows the public authorities to act promptly when it's confronted with an unwelcome foreign investor, especially a foreign investor in the public health areas in the current situation. So in this specific situation, maybe this reforms in the FDI screening regulation would be more efficient. I hope I have answered your question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for your elaboration.
Thank you.
Now the opposition will be continued by Dr. Kaufmann. Dr. Kaufmann is Associate Professor of Private Law at our university, and she's also a member of the Assessment Committee.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Pro-Rector. Dear candidates, dear Huizi, I really enjoyed reading your thesis. It is well structured and clearly written, and the methodology used is clearly explained and appropriate to answer the research question. You show a good understanding of multiple fields of law, competition law, FDI law, corporate law, and multiple methods, comparative law, economic analysis of law, and you integrated all that in an original way to answer your research question. You even managed to integrate very recent developments, such as the impact of the pandemic on the public interest considerations in the UK Enterprise Act. For all these reasons, I want to congratulate you wholeheartedly with your PhD thesis. The question I have for you is, in fact, to explain a bit further what you already mentioned in your answer to the previous question. You referred to what you mentioned in your first recommendation, that the protection of the environment and the local community in principle belongs to the corporate governance realm of the target company and should be addressed by private law mechanisms. And only in cases where a takeover directly threatens the national environment objectives, or when the interest of the general public of the local regions are harmed, only then may the public interest mechanisms in the public laws be considered after a rigorous assessment. I would like to hear a bit more about two elements included in this first recommendation. And the first one is how you see that exactly, how do you see that exactly, the protection of environmental interests via private law mechanisms? Does that imply legally binding obligations for the target company, for the acquiring company? Who should take action to enforce compliance? Yeah, a bit more clarity about the content and the possibilities of enforcement of these private law mechanisms. And then secondly, where do you draw the line between cases that are to be left to private law and cases where public law mechanisms can be considered because of these national environment objectives or the interests of the general public of the local regions? Could you possibly give an example to illustrate the distinction? Something that should be left to private law, something that should be left, that could be dealt with by public law?
Esteemed opponent, thank you very much for your candid comments and for your questions. If I understood correctly, you raised two questions. The first question, as I mentioned in my thesis, that there might be a distinction between the protection of the environment and the community at the public interest level and at the corporate governance level. You would like to know if it belongs to the corporate governance field, then is there a binding obligation? And if yes, who has this obligation? And if there are enforceable mechanisms in the corporate governance regime? And your second question mentioned that if there is an explicit line between these two levels, and if there an example. Yeah. And with regard to your first question, I argue that in principle, protection of the non-public interest considerations, such as the protection of the environment and local community, should be regarded as a corporate governance regime. In the current corporate governance laws, corporate laws and corporate governance codes of the three jurisdictions, there are such rules regarding the board of directors' fiduciary duties to have regard to the corporate interests. And in interpreting such interest of the company, the environment protection and the interests of the community are usually regarded as part of the corporate social responsibilities. But I also mentioned that there are some generality in these roles and the lack of the guidance for their implementation. However, we can see that all of the three jurisdictions have made some advancement to promote the environmental protection and protection of the community in the corporate governance regime. For example, in the UK and Germany, the two jurisdictions have required the board of directors to provide for a report on the non-financial stakeholder issues. And with this information on the environment and the corporate consequences on the community, the relevant stakeholders can be protected to some extent. And also in China, the corporate governance code also requires such disclosure about the listed companies' fulfillment of social responsibilities in environmental protection. But however, it has to be admitted that currently these corporate governance mechanisms are deficient. That's why I, in my recommendation, proposed that in the future, we may encourage the corporate law to establish like an advisory stakeholder panel representing, for example, the different stakeholders such as the environmental protection groups and the representatives of the community, and to give the representatives of environmental protection and the community to give them an opportunity to be heard in corporate decisions. And also maybe in the future reforms, we can incentivize the institutional shareholders to consider more of them, because most of the institutional shareholders have been signatories of the principles for responsible investments launched by the United Nations, which have integrated the ESG standards. And to fulfill their duties under these principles and the ESG standards, we may encourage them to think more about these environment and community and other stakeholders. As regard to your second question, usually there would not be a distinction or a clear line or boundary between the environmental protection at the like the federal government level or at the local region level. However, we observed that in the previous cases of Germany, when the public authority it recognizes whether the takeovers consequences can come to impact on the region or have come to have impacted the federal government's environmental objectives, it's possible for the public authority to make such assessment. For example, in the UK, I have raised an example that in Kraft's takeover of February, Kraft's promised to continue use some fair trade cocoa products to protect the environment after the takeover. However, after the takeover, it breaks such promise, and this change of strategy would have an impact on the environment. Nevertheless, we can foresee that this impact will stay at the local region level. But in other cases, if the takeover of a chemistry company will also lead to the changes of the corporate strategies and lead to the emissions of harmful chemicals, which may affect a large region or even some cities or provinces alongside the river. This may become our societal interests that need to be protected by public laws. Yeah, I hope this answered your question. Thank you.
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much. Certainly, yeah.
Thank you so much. Now the opposition will be continued by Professor Kemp. Professor Kemp is Professor of Corporate Governance and Corporate Regulation at our university and also a member of the Assessment Committee.
Thank you, Mr. Prorector and dear candidate. You've conducted very interesting research into the ways in which societal interests can be protected as part of corporate takeovers. And by reviewing this topic from several distinct views in a comparative perspective, you've been able to provide valuable insights into the subject matter. It was a joy to read your manuscript, which by now we also have in the form of this beautiful book. In chapter 7 of your manuscript, you refer to, and I'm summarizing now, the advantages of the UK mechanisms as included in the City Code that provide offerers with the freedom to choose between binding promises and non-binding promises. And then you explain on page 299 of your manuscript that this design provides the offerer, and now I'm quoting, with more autonomy and can increase their incentives to keep promises in a later stage. You then recommend that that Germany and China introduce similar duties on the offerer, and you've just repeated that also in your presentation you've given just now. I've enjoyed reading your description of UK law and the comparison with Germany and Chinese law, but I must admit that I do have a question on this very specific point. When making policy recommendations, which is one of the things you do in your manuscript, that relate to whether the offerer should make binding or non-binding promises for the benefit of societal interests, I would expect that the main question would be, or at least part of it would be, which interests the board of the target company need to serve on the national corporate law. If that is creating enlightened shareholder value, such as the case in the UK, and you've described that in your manuscript, this would arguably lead to a different outcome, or at least a different consequences, than when this is creating value for all stakeholders under a stakeholder model, which is the case in Germany, which is one of the jurisdictions for which you make this recommendation. Could you explain if and how these fundamental differences in corporate governance approaches, so stakeholder versus enlightened shareholder value, impact your recommendation that Germany should basically take over the practices that are already used and implemented in the United Kingdom?
Hello, esteemed opponent. Thank you very much for your comments and your question. With regard to your first question, I think it is if there is a difference between the two corporate governance models, and if yes, how, then it comes to the second question, how will one jurisdiction such as Germany to follow like such suggestions or experiences from the UK, as I may recommend it in my thesis. And with regard to the first question, I think yes, there are definitely differences between the corporate governance models, not only in the UK, Germany, but in all of the 3 jurisdictions. And I discussed about this in my introduction chapter, because as in the UK, it's have traditionally featured in this shareholder value model. And then it comes to an enlightened shareholder value model, which requires a board of directors to consider not only the shareholders' interests, but also the interests of the company. And then in its corporate law, it provides the rules to give examples of such stakeholders. But there is also some problems with these provisions, because it didn't give explicit rule whether the board of directors have regard to constitutes an obligation or fiduciary duty, and to which extent it should be an obligation. So it leads to the debates whether the UK have changed this shareholder value model. And in my thesis, I mentioned that in essence, they are the same. but we have to admit that these general provisions which promote the board of directors to think about other stakeholders may constitute fiduciary duties to these stakeholders in some specific situations. For example, when it's in a normal operational status, the board of directors don't have a fiduciary duty to the creditors because they are two different parties of one transaction, and there would be like conflicts of interest. But when the company is at the brink of bankruptcy, the board of directors may then have the fiduciary duty to these creditors and even the employees. And the takeovers, it has such effect that may lead to restructuring of a company and then put the company under the risk of bankruptcy. That's why the board of directors, from my point of view, should also consider other stakeholders' interests. And I also mentioned in my thesis that corporate law should leave the autonomy to the board of directors for them to decide which stakeholders it represents. Because from my perspective, protecting stakeholders is like the task of corporate governance and should be decided by the board, not by rigid rules of the corporate law. And in Germany, it's long been featured as a stakeholder-centered model, and now the supervisory board and employee representatives can play a role by considering other stakeholders' interests. So when I'm suggesting that Germany should also introduce such mechanisms like post-offer undertakings, what I really recommend is that the target board, they should tailor these mechanisms. But these mechanisms should maybe still subject to the supervisory board, as supervisory board has a decisive role in the takeovers. And in that way, the employee representative on the supervisory board may take better consideration of other stakeholders. So to this extent, although the two models have some differences, the relevant post-offer undertaking mechanism could be borrowed in Germany. Also in China, as the government may play some strong role in the corporate governance of some companies. When the company in China introduces such post-offer undertakings, it may also use the CSRC, like the public authorities may play a strong supervisory role in the implementation of these arrangements. So I think it's also doesn't conflict with the existing differences in the three models, but it can better use the existing mechanisms in the UK and combine the corporate governance features in its own jurisdiction and put them together to play a better role in the future. I hope this have answered the question. Thank you.
Now I have to slowly ask Professor Kemp whether he is indeed satisfied with the answer or whether there would still give rise to a follow-up.
No, thank you. The answer was very satisfactory. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. In that case, I will ask Professor Faure to raise a second question.
Thank you for this opportunity. Mr. Rector, I'll try to be brief given the time. Mrs. Candidate, you have a chapter 2 where you talk about the market failures and takeovers, and you discuss the law and economics, where you discuss all the traditional market failures. But you know, the puzzle that I have a little bit, the way that you describe it, it seems as if by the end of the day, takeovers would be beneficial. Yet there is a wide empirical evidence that shows that in practice, most takeovers result in failures. In other words, that after the takeover, shareholder value decreases. And the reason that people give is managerial myopia. So that they say there are all kinds of phenomenon, psychological phenomenon, as a result of which the managers behave like the emperors in the past times. They want to get bigger empires and hope that they get more remuneration and then they have tunnel vision, over-optimism, and they think that the benefits of the takeovers will be a lot larger than they actually are. So my simple question to you is, why did you not look better at the practice of takeovers and at the practical results in terms of shareholder value? And why did you not incorporate this behavioral aspect? Don't you agree with me that this managerial myopia might also constitute a market failure that we should take into account? Looking forward to your answer.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you very much.
You may very, very briefly answer the
Thank you very much for your question. I think the manager view of the phenomenon you have raised is mainly related to the protection of the relevant societal interests of the acquirer company. But in my thesis, I focused on the relevant societal interests of the target company. That's why I didn't mention too much about that. And also, I agree with you that an interdisciplinary research should be conducted in the future, which may complement the practices with more empirical researches in takeovers. Thank you.
Huizi, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The degree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. And I request that you and your company online await the results of our deliberations and our return in this meeting. Yeah, quid say I. The degree committee here present online has assessed the quality of your thesis and the quality of your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taken into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Olaerts is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. And I now invite your supervisor to take the floor.
Do you promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent and independent and responsible?
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present online, I hereby confer upon you, Huizi and I, the degree of doctor and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. And as evidence of this, you will soon receive the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the supervisor affixed with the official seal of the university, as shown by the beadle.
Dr. I, dear Huizi, let me start by congratulating you wholeheartedly on having received the degree of doctor. Also on behalf of my colleague Mieke Olaerts, who just virtually gave you this diploma as a testimony of this degree. You obtained your bachelor in law in 2013 from the prestigious university COPL in Beijing. And after that, you decided to join CESL, the China EU School of Law. That is where we first met, as I was teaching the course on EU competition law there, together with my colleague Caroline Kaufmann, present today as well, in November 2015. You did brilliantly in that course and in the whole CESL program, ranking among the very best students of the year. While you were still in Beijing in your final year of CESL, you sent a mail to my colleague Olaerts in August 2016, asking for the possibilities to do a PhD in the field of corporate governance, hoping for a scholarship from the CSC. You knew Mieke, as you had followed a comparative corporate governance course in Maastricht during a short exchange from CESL. Mieke forwarded your email to me, asking for advice, because I had worked with Chinese PhD researchers many times before. I looked at your list of grades at CESL and immediately advised Mieke to take this mail very seriously. And since I was about to go to Beijing again, I was able to meet you personally in my CESL office for a chat about your PhD. Somehow, we came up with the brilliant idea to combine corporate governance and competition law in one research topic, with both Mieke and me as your supervisors. Some months later, and after a successful interview by the Huizi, you submitted a nice research proposal on the protection of the public interests in takeovers and received CSC funding in 2017. Supervising you together with Mieke was a very nice and also very interesting process. During the first 2 years of your research, the three of us often met in her office, and there now, discussing draft texts and brainstorming over new ideas while eating some of the snacks you brought from China, or the European snacks that Mieke kept in her office. It must have been difficult for you to listen to two supervisors having rather different backgrounds, both coming with their own views on the direction of your research. I think Mieke and I almost learned as much from this process as you did. Fortunately, you were always taking your recorder, so you could keep track of the discussions we had and the ideas that often suddenly came up during these meetings, also from you, of course. While you continuously had doubts about your research progress, we actually thought and told you every single time we met that you were making great progress along the way. You presented your work at seminars, conferences, followed all courses from the graduate school and the Jus Communi program, as well as a challenging master course in law and economics. Furthermore, you spent some time in Hamburg in the summer of 2019 to work on the comparative part of the research. You also went back to China a couple of times, always nicely asking our permission for these trips. And in the meantime, yes, dear audience, you even got married. I would say that these past 4 years have been very successful and busy for you. And then I almost forgot the 2 papers you worked on and which are still in the pipeline. Unfortunately, the last 2 years have been less from ideal because of the corona situation, of course. During the 3rd year of your research, you stayed in China much longer than expected and even had to put the CSC scholarship on hold for a while. Fortunately, you could come back to Europe in late 2020 after having had to postpone your flight a few times. The idea was to spend the final year of your PhD in Maastricht. During this time, despite strict corona regulations, we had virtual meetings, but also met a few times in the faculty garden and once in the boardroom with our face masks on and keeping 2.5 meters distance. However, you then had to go back to China earlier than you initially thought, in June of this year, to prepare for the job market. Hence, you were writing and updating the last parts of the thesis in China. Due to the very tight corona regulations over there, you had to spend 3 weeks in quarantine in a hotel in Shanghai, where we discussed concluding chapters of the book with you over Zoom. Well, these must have been very tough times for you. You certainly remained very productive. You can be very proud of the end result, the book that you've presented so successfully to us today. The book includes a comprehensive, integrated analysis of societal interests and corporate takeovers, combining and integrating several legal domains and law and economic analysis, while focusing on 3 jurisdictions. Let me be clear, Huizi, we will surely miss you very much in Maastricht. You were always willing to help your colleagues and friends. And like this happens in the CSC community, you have become a Jia, an older sister, for several of the PhD researchers who are still here. You have also become an Ayi for my 2 sons. They remember very well that you, together with your colleagues Wu Qian and Li Shuo, visited our house some years ago to enjoy a Chinese hot pot. And from another occasion, they remember the dumplings prepared by your mother that you brought us. My sons normally only give such high praise about homemade dumplings to my wife, the only exception so far being the dumplings made by Wang Hui Ayi and your mother. Of course, Lily also has fond memories of you. We will always remember the day before you took the flight back to China in June, when you joined us for a goodbye walk in Maastricht, through the city park, along the Maas River, and through the old town. I'm going to conclude. Although it's a pity that you have decided for the moment not to continue in academics, Mieke and I are also very happy knowing that you found a nice job at Law Press China, an SOE affiliated to the Chinese Ministry of Justice. In this job, you cooperate with many famous publishers and journals. So in a way, you are still in touch with academia. We also know that you will remain in close contact with Metro and ICGI, and hence the Faculty of Law, by joining some online seminars and events. In any case, we will make sure that also in the non-virtual world, our paths will cross again, either in China or in Europe. For now, you can finally relax. The moment you have been so anxiously waiting for, Wednesday evening, 8 December, 6 p.m. Beijing time, has arrived. It is now time to celebrate, and you really, really deserve it. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mieke and Nils.
Now, dear Dr. Ai, also on behalf of the university and the Faculty of Law, I congratulate you with the degree of doctor that you just acquired. The degree of doctor at Maastricht University, where we have indeed come to know you as a great academic citizen, as also one of your supervisors just made very clear in his laudatio. Congratulations to you. Many congratulations also to your family and friends watching online. And I also congratulate your supervisors, Professors Olaerts and Philipsen. And I thank the members of the degree committee, in particular our members from outside of Maastricht, Professors Chen and Wijsaar. To the audience online, thank you so much for watching this ceremony. It was good to have you for this festive event, and indeed do celebrate. And with this, I declare officially this academic ceremony closed.
Thank you.